Okay, now let me just get this shared into the group. Okay. All right, I think we are live on Facebook. All right, so welcome everyone to May Book Club. We are here tonight for our author talk with Dr. Rachel Allyn, and she is the author of The Pleasure is All Yours, Reclaim Your Body's Bliss and Reignite Your Passion for Life. So we are so thrilled to have you here.
I'm so happy to be here. I love having these conversations. And so it's always an honor to be asked.
Yeah, well, it's been fun. I attempted to do something different this month and try to do a live in-person book discussion, but there just wasn't enough interest. But I just keep trying every month to reinvent it and get more participation because we've had some amazing authors on this book club, so including you. So
Thank you.
happy to have you here.
Yeah, I think it's kind of, we're in a little bit of that limbo right now still of people coming and meeting in person versus doing it this way. And I know a lot of people have kids
and there's
in
Zoom,
school.
Zoom fatigue, and like it's a weird place right now. So that's why we have the live stream and the recording so people can catch it afterwards. So all right. So Rachel, why don't you tell us maybe just a little bit of your background about who you are and how you came to write this book?
Right. Well, I grew up in the Midwest, and I was fortunate that I had a mom that was really more open as far as my body, the reproductive body, just sort of shame free. And I also was an athlete, and then I ended up really kind of channeling a lot of my athleticism into wanting to do yoga in order to cross train, which then of course yoga became so much more for me. It also became really a way to connect with community, a way um, really go down a spiritual path and cope and heal in that way. Also a way to more scientifically understand how we have trauma and stress in the body, and yoga can be a tool to self-regulate. So I ended up though professionally really starting to name that I was doing a lot of yoga psychology. And I had also prior to that been specializing in graduate school in San Francisco on relationship therapy and sex therapy. And so I ended up ultimately merging my interest in somatic work. So doing a lot of mind body psychology, where we invite the body into the conversation, with yoga as my primary somatic tool. And then I focused a lot on that. And then I also was focusing a lot on relationship and sexual health. And then I've now with the book really merged the two in trying to heal, particularly in the United States, our long history of repression of all different kinds and of all different types of pleasures. And so it's really about this idea of bodyfulness, which I'm sure we can go into more. But ultimately, I wrote the book that I felt like I wanted to read so long ago, the book that also could be really for the average everyday reader, because a lot of what I noticed is some books are really more scholarly and they come from research journals, or some of the information out there is a little bit too woo-woo for some people, as far as maybe some of the terminology, with tantra or yoga, some of that stuff was kind of harder for them. They felt like they weren't a yogi. So I wanted something that was really for the average person to heal the relationship with their body, learn how their body could be this wonderful resource, not only to heal past trauma, but to regulate in order to open up to all sorts of pleasures and delights of all kinds, which help us heal and also can help us in our relationships.
Yeah. And, I think, just the whole repression thing. And I too grew up in a house where, my mom, and particularly my mom's mom, my grandmother, really instilled, that wear what you want to wear, don't care what other people tell you should or shouldn't wear. And I think we're seeing a lot of that right now with, like school dress codes, like girls shouldn't wear, tank tops or have anything too low cut. And it's like,
Yeah.
we just keep reinforcing this repression instead
Mhm.
of, embracing our bodies and who we
Yeah.
are.
Right, right. And there's a lot of emotional repression, sort of bury it under, sweep it under the rug. Don't talk about it,
Yes.
don't feel it. And I think not only does it not go away, but it can disconnect us from ourselves, from others, and it can come back. Those emotions can come back stronger or in misdirected ways. So, with connection to our body, we can connect to our visceral body as well. So,
Mm.
and I think sometimes it's hard for people to understand, like, wait, emotions are in my body. How do I listen to the language of my body? How can that help me, feel better or prevent me from snapping at somebody or being reactive? And that's where I think it's really exciting what we're learning with just different ways that we can kind of move and breathe and release from the body, or find ways we can find containment in the body that does regulate our emotions. But yeah, the repression shows up in all sorts of ways, whether it be clothing, and of course, there's very particular set of rules around based on sort of gender and age and race.
Right.
So it's like, let's just all be human, allow us to be human. And I understand parents obviously have to, have some conversations with their children around what is and isn't appropriate. But I think for centuries it was really just a bit too much. We're denigrating the body as just savage and primitive and animalistic, and that everybody should only be in their minds and in their intellect, and that was the seat of all reason and logic. So the body was really something just to be controlled for so long in the United States. And then also when it came to feeling good and expressing our body and pleasures in our body, and certainly sexual pleasures, those were very much also like denigrated and shamed and repressed. When really what we know is that different ways of connecting to our body and healing through our body, and different ways of expressing and releasing in our body, are really healing, really regenerative, really lead us to connect to others, which increases compassion for others. So the first part of the book is really, because the book is divided into three sections. And that first part is really like, how did we get here? How did we get to this place where
Right.
everybody has a body and everybody came from a sexual being, yet everybody has a story, at least one story or two or three, of shame or disconnection or confusion from kind of growing up that really has lived with them, maybe into, adulthood. So I want to help set people free from that, at least, so I explain in the first section, like, all right, this is sort of our history, this is our roots, and this is where it's led us to be kind of one of the most oppressed countries in the world.
I recently watched Being the Ricardos, the
Mm,
movie about Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, and it focuses a lot on her pregnancy and how she wanted to write it into the show. And they were like, "No way, no, we can't do this." And they eventually did. And then you saw, oh, I just saw your dog. Or is it a cat?
oh, yeah, I have a cat and a
Cat.
dog around.
Sorry, distracted.
Yeah.
But then, like it went on, like they had to be in separate beds. They had to show, two twin beds separated, and they really tried to cover up her pregnancy. And he wasn't allowed to say pregnant. And he said like expecting, in his little
Oh,
accent. And it's just fascinating. I mean, like that wasn't that long ago,
right.
right?
Wow. That was
And
what,
like,
60s?
don't
Yeah.
we all know where babies come from? But like, why were we so adamant on hiding it? And I know my mom even talks about back, when she was pregnant, mainly with my older siblings, but like, you really covered it up. Like kind of tenty clothing. And now women are embracing the pregnant body, and the pregnant body is beautiful in my opinion. I was a photographer for many years, and I loved photographing pregnancy sessions. But it's just so interesting how it was just like so repressed, and we don't want to talk about it. And oh, God forbid we show that on TV, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I think my explanation for it is that I think that, earlier with our puritanical roots, I think that it was really a lot about kind of control. And when you think of these life force energies, such as our erotic energy, or just thinking about kind of yoga, when you have like that post sort of yoga glow, or that yoga
Yes.
enthusiasm. There's these things that I think were hard for people to understand. And when there's confusion, or especially when there's like a kind of a charge to that energy, it was scary to people, and they were like, well, let's just put this in this box over there because we don't know how to manage it or understand it. And when really we think about, a pregnant woman, I mean, my goodness, energetically, and just the creation, I mean, she is creating life. And yet that whole region of her body and that whole process has been like silenced and
Mm,
shamed. I mean, there's certainly, that's obviously been changing and getting better and better. We're reclaiming that. But so many women are just sort of cut off energetically, or even just knowing like what their body looks like. And I know for me, I mean, yoga was certainly an amazing path of getting me to just slow down and actually like listen and be in my body, versus
mhm,
just that I was such a competitive athlete, and to really befriend and regulate my body. And so I really credit yoga with changing my life and
mhm.
just saving me from so many reactive behaviors. But but I think, there's can be a lot of misconceptions that people have that maybe don't do yoga, as far as, is it a religion, or is it this or that? And again, it's
Right.
this fear of the unknown. Then people are like, let's put it away, rather than the curiosity of like, curiosity in medicine around like, how can our body be a source of physical and emotional healing versus just cutting it off? Or how can pleasure be something that we don't reduce to sex, but also see pleasure in play, pleasure in rest,
Mhm,
pleasure in connecting to our senses, and how that is also a portal to like healing and, and really our humanness. So I'm
mhm.
trying to kind of flip the script on some of these things here. But it takes time. Mm.
Right, right. And and like listening to our bodies tell us everything we need to know. And we often just ignore it or don't listen to it. Like maybe you have a nagging knee issue and you just like, it's just my knee, whatever. And it's actually trying to tell you have a back problem or whatever it might be, but if we really take the time to listen, and that's what yoga allows us to do, is to get quiet and turn inward and listen to our body and feel our body, right? And to like really feel it.
Right,
Not just, like, oh, it's just a nagging knee problem.
right,
um
right.
I think that's where yoga is so incredible for healing.
Absolutely. Yes, yes. To your points of what you said as far as overriding the body, I'll start with that. But then I have a lot to say about yoga too. But I talk about in the book, and then I did it. Actually, I did a TEDx talk, a Minneapolis TEDx talk that the book is based on. And I said in the TEDx talk that so often people do override their body's messages, and they do so with
Yeah.
either a stiff upper lip or a stiff drink. and and
Yes.
right, I've been there, I've done that. But it and I'm not shaming anybody. It's all about, really just being intentional and noticing when you're sort of wanting to numb. But it is so true what you said, that our body is it's so wise, it's always rooting for our survival. But and as kids, we tend to be much better at listening to that, and much more
Mhm.
intuitive. And then we kind of get those storylines and those shoulds and shouldn'ts, and we get the constriction, and the constriction builds on more constriction. My jaw is a good example. I'm always having,
Yes, me too.
um, yeah, yeah. And so I talk in the book, the second section of the book really goes into talking about bodyfulness, with there being three parts to bodyfulness. And the first is just, are you paying attention to your body, like to your breath? That's a big one that most people recognize, to body temperature, to digestion, to
Mhm.
intuition, to right side versus left side, to muscular activation, to kind of how an event or a person makes you feel, all these different systems we have in our body. And so that can be just kind of a practice in and of itself. But I recognize that for some people, it's really vulnerable to be in their body. And
Yeah.
so that you have to go slow. And that's where I think working with either a yoga teacher or a psychologist who is trained to work with people who have some trauma is important. And you got to go really slow. Um,
Mhm.
but I do think that part of why yoga is so beautiful for that first part and the second part of bodyfulness that I can get into is because there is such an invitation of curiosity, of like, at least certain teachers, like I was trained to do trauma sensitive yoga teaching, and a lot of what we do is give options, because
Yeah.
then people can kind of ask their body, do I want to go faster or slower? Do I want to stop? Do I want to kind of add in a little extra twist, or, maybe see how it feels if my arms go in this direction. And all of that builds what's called interoception, with that deeper body awareness that really tells us, like, what do I really need right now? Not like what my craving is saying, or, to avoid or numb
Right.
some pain, or, not what somebody else told me I should do, but it's this inner knowing from the body up. That and yoga is not the only intentional movement practice that does that, but it is, I would say, the most thorough, and really getting into it with all of the chakras to be able to cultivate that interoception, that deep inner body intelligence.
So Rachel, let's maybe go into the second section of your book and telling us a little bit about what section 2 entails.
Yeah. I talk about bodyfulness, and then I go into also talking about it from explaining it from both an Eastern and Western perspective. So I have some research, like kind of Western medicine research. And then I also talk about the chakra system and Ayurvedic medicine and how it connects to that and supports it. But bodyfulness is really, I like to say it's like mindfulness unleashed, given that mindfulness is really helpful, but it is still a little bit too focused on the mind and doesn't invite the body in enough, and doesn't allow enough opportunity for the letting go and releasing some of the stuck trauma in our body. But there's 3 Ds to bodyfulness. I say the first one is diving in. The second one is discharging, and that's where there's the movement and the self-regulation. And the third one is delight. So I explained a little bit about the first one, of just what's happening in my body, sort of diving in and like, what's going on in here, a daily practice. And then the discharge of the second part of bodyfulness is really discharging the trauma through all sorts of movement and release. It could even be released in the form of tears and sighing and breath. But also certainly release of the way our issues are in our tissues. So getting it kind of out of the connective tissue with movements. So a lot of intentional movements like yoga or qigong, but also different types of exercise, or even things like foam rolling, massage, acupuncture. Really, we want to just have expression, not repression. So kind of movement. And sometimes I also talk about, if people are really overwhelmed, sometimes we need containment first. So maybe that's when we run our hands along our body, or put our hands in our armpits, or we get a hug, co-regulation from someone else, or maybe we go into a child's pose or have a weighted blanket. So that way to just really center and ground before we can kind of go on to some of those other ways of releasing. And sometimes it's as simple as releasing through opening and shutting the jaw a little bit. We were both talking about how we have kind of jaws where our body might try to protect us. Sometimes it's as simple as like noticing that, taking a couple belly breaths, bringing a little healing touch, opening and shutting the jaw. And that is your self-regulation in that moment. And it took you 10 seconds.
Right.
So it doesn't have to be a ton, but it is about practicing and making it routine. And then how that gets us to this third part of bodyfulness is that I really believe that when we have within us tools to self-regulate, to ride the wave of our pain, we can seek pleasure not to numb or avoid or run away, but we seek it to enhance our life, to enrich our life. Because obviously pleasure can be something that people over rely on, or get addiction, different addictions or different ways that they are independence of these things outside of us. And that third part of bodyfulness is also just about reclaiming our right to feel good, and which is particularly challenging, I think, for women. They get a lot of messages.
Yeah.
And as nurturers, they can feel guilty if they do give to themselves. But it's so essential so that they aren't getting burnt out or depleted either.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a little bit about the bodyfulness. And then I share, like I said, some just different studies, research looking at how it's important to get the issues out of our tissues. And then looking at these ancient wisdom traditions of the chakra system and Ayurvedic medicine, which they also really look at the ways that we can connect to our body and have regulatory practices with our body, one from an energetic level with the chakras, and then with Ayurvedic medicine, a lot more of like lifestyle tools. And so for people who are newer to the chakras and Ayurvedic medicine, this is like a good intro for you. But if it's something you're already familiar with, which a lot of the people who read your magazine probably are more familiar already with Ayurvedic medicine and chakras, it's still helpful because it applies it in a more modern way as far as this idea again of repression and trauma that's in our body, and sort of a nice way to integrate these Eastern practices into our day-to-day healing. So I could keep going
Yeah.
on, but I want to give you a chance to weigh in with your
Yeah. And,
questions.
I just think it's so important. And, you know, the word pleasure, I think for many can have so many different connotations or meanings to it. And as you're talking, I'm just thinking like, well, pleasure, self-care, right? Like literally it's a form of self-care. And again, self-care is a word people think like self-care means like getting a mani or a massage or you know going to the spa with cucumbers over your eyes, which those are all forms of self-care, but that's more of a I don't want to say extreme, I can't think of the right word, but it's more of a more extreme self-care, for lack of a
Yeah.
better word. But self-care could be as simple as like you were saying, like the 10 seconds to just like check in with your jaw, right? Like, and it doesn't have to be expensive, because I think we get tied into like massage and manicure pedicure and all that, and it's like, well, that's not accessible to everyone, and
Yeah.
self-care needs to be accessible to everyone. And it's turning inward and listening to your body, that interoception, and
Mm.
um and pleasure. I think you're really right with especially women. I was just thinking about this morning, and I'm not a mom, but I watch my mom friends and they are just like maxed out,
Yeah.
you know, between work, kids, household, they're just maxed out.
Yeah.
And while, going to your kid's game might be pleasurable, no doubt,
Mm.
but is that, what we need? Like we need more than that. We need like our own individual quiet time. We
Right.
put the kids to bed and we read them a book or, whatever, and get the kids ready for bed and get them comfy, but we don't do that for ourselves.
Right, right. I mean, I don't know where all of this kind of guilt all like really started specifically for women. I mean, I think that it again goes to some of our puritanical roots, but that women particularly have been hit hard with these kind of sneaky messages that then you're a bad mom, or if you're.
Yeah.
And yet, really, we all know what it feels like when our glass is filled up, when we feel rejuvenated. We are just naturally a better friend, a better parent, a better community member. And I think maybe that is part of, to your point, that we need to remind people it doesn't have to be an expensive
Mhm.
massage, although I would recommend people do that from time to time. But
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, yeah. Sometimes it's like, I think having like taking 20 minutes to have like a nap or a yoga nidra meditation or something. And it's really because we all deserve that. And I think there have been messages that have said that pleasure is indulgent and lavish and excessive. And maybe you only get a little morsel of
Right.
it after you've bent over backwards. When really, I think we need to say that rest and different sort of healing pleasures are just as important as sort of our work and our go and our more kind of the masculine energy side of things. That is, that's true balance. So yeah, everybody benefits when we just stop and take the time. And it's when I work with clients, I really help them to understand like what are the ones that go into their like kind of pleasure practices toolbox, just as I help them with their sort of somatic self-regulation toolbox, because it is a little bit different for everybody.
Mhm.
For some people, it's going a daily bath is like a non-negotiable, whereas for somebody else, like a daily walk or something I help people with their top three sort of embodiment, pleasurable non-negotiables that you try to really instill basically every day, because that when you get those in, you feel better and then you're just better with everybody you're around. And you got to give yourself some grace that some days you're not going
Yeah.
to, but it's a practice. But I do think that the word pleasure and the word sensuality are these words that have been so reduced down to like one
Mhm.
thing, even though sensuality, it's literally about our senses, which could include even just closing your eyes as
Yes.
you take your first bite of food. That's a sensual bite of food you're taking. It doesn't have anything to do with sort of the erotic world. But so a lot of my work is just trying to help people reframe things. And even, we think about moments of pleasure, that is actually what creates longer lasting states of joy and happiness. So we actually wouldn't really have joy or happiness if there weren't sort of these building blocks of kind of pleasurable moments that we feel like in our heart, in our senses, and in our body as well. So we can't really skip over them if we want to have some joy in our life. But I do think if you just look at the cover of the book, it's probably pretty confusing. Like, are we talking, is this, about couples, helping them with desire,
Right.
better sex, or is this about, well, what about your body? So it's a few books in one. But I
And
just love kind of the play on words.
and I can see how your book could potentially make somebody be like, "Ooh, I don't think I can read that."
Right.
And they're the ones who need to read it, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the last chapter does go into tools, because I talk about pleasure and I include erotic as one of them. And the last chapter does go into different, more erotic practices as an individual or as a couple. So if somebody's really that squeamish, they can skip that last chapter,
Yep.
and at
Yep.
the same time, like you said, maybe all the more so. But yeah, talk about ways to have more sensual pleasures in your life, more playful pleasures and creativity, especially given parents, to your point too, about a lot of parents, like they'll make play dates for their kids, but not for themselves.
Yeah.
And also trying to help people find some sort of moments of like liveliness or flow states where you can kind of be immersed in what you're doing, and the pleasure of being really immersed in that, the writing that you're doing, or what the work project that you're doing, finding those things where time sort of is lost, and you're really so focused because it's something that you really enjoy. And that can happen at work or in play.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that actually, those are all building blocks to also perhaps benefiting in the bedroom. Because if you think about it, if you're able to kind of be playful and laugh at yourself, if you're able to slow down and have presence of your senses, if you're able to kind of be immersed and focused in something that you enjoy, and have better awareness of your body and body boundaries, all of that helps with emotional and physical intimacy in the long run. So it's
Right.
kind of like these building blocks also to get to that as well.
Well, I love it. And, such an important topic. Um, just I can't stress the self-care component enough. Like, I just feel like, especially coming out of this pandemic, like, I just feel like we're kind of all a little high strung right now. Right. And yeah, and we just need to take a little extra excuse me, a little extra care of ourselves. And, the cliche, but, put your own face mask on before you help the person next to you. It's like you have to keep yourself filled up in order to keep your family or your loved ones filled up. It's,
Yeah.
and I think we often do it the other way around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also to your point, with everybody kind of feeling on edge from the pandemic, what's interesting, when I was doing some research for the book, just how much there were these studies that showed that when people have activities that are embodiment sorts of activities in a group, so that could be a group yoga class, indoors or outdoors, that could be like a group musical concert, so some way in which there's some embodiment component and you're with a larger group, how they measured people's I don't know exactly how they did it, but they were able to measure and see that people dramatically increased their feelings of compassion for others and altruism for others. So I think that's like kind of what we need. If we can get back to these sort of group spaces where we're engaging with our senses, whether it be yoga or music or other ways of kind of taking a hike, because it really bonds us. So it goes from self-care to collective care, really. And that's where our self-care goes beyond and is really about the collective, which I think is amazing, right? When we can have both. But, and then the other thing too, I was just going to add that it is, the book also really suggests in some of these different pleasure practices and being in our body is like trying to not have it be so much about the outcome, because we are such a hustle culture and kind of what's the goal and the agenda. And so also some of these things are about just sort of yielding, and can we just be in the process of the yoga pose as we go from one, flowing from one to the next, or the creative activity that we're doing, or kind of the sensual walk in nature, but not always like racing to the finish line is also, I think, very healing and an important practice that a lot of people, probably myself included, have sometimes struggled with. but that really regulates the nervous system as well.
Well, Rachel, this has been so lovely to chat with you. Thank you so much for being here. If people would like to follow you, get in touch with you, what are ways people can find you?
Well, I have my website, drrachelallyn.com, Allen with the Y, and then my Instagram. That's kind of the main. I've mainly narrowed it down to to Instagram as my main social media. I got to practice what I preach, right? I can't be in front of a screen all the time. So, but Instagram is also Dr. Rachel Allyn, all one word. And yeah, the book it's through Shambhala Publications, so that's a great place to get it. But it's also on Amazon and Barnes and Nobles and everything. But yeah, just wanting to spread pleasure to the people and spread bodyfulness to people to really help kind of heal some of this body disconnection that we have.
Well, thank you so much for being here tonight. And thank you everyone for watching. Again, it's Dr. Rachel Allyn. The pleasure is all yours. And our June book club is going to be Corey Hahn, Rituals of the Soul. And if you have our current issue of the magazine, there is an excerpt in the magazine. So you can get a little taste of her book within the magazine. And our live author talk with Corey will be Tuesday, June 28th at 10 a.m. We have a time change there from our evening because she is currently living in, I believe, India. So we had to switch up the times a little bit to accommodate her time zone. So Rachel, thank you so much for being here. Any final words of wisdom for everyone?
Well, I just love to tell people, movement is medicine. So just trying to find that. And again, it doesn't have to be a lot. And I guess I said a couple of the other little rhymes I love, issues are in our tissues.
I love that
and,
one.
Yeah. And just think expression, not repression. So hopefully those sayings can be just a mantra for people to remember.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks, Amy.